Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much to Medact for inviting me. I'm delighted to follow these very dense and important interventions, one on morality and the other on law. I'm going to talk about the complete abrogation of both morality and law. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the normalising of torture and about accountability. Don't worry, it may sound tough, but it's full of interesting people. And I want to start with words that are not my own, but from a man who's actually lived the erosion of ethics in the climate of impunity. And he's one of a number of people I'm going to mention who I wish were giving this talk rather than me. But as I go along, you'll understand why they're not giving this talk. So this is the words of Murat Kurnaz, who's a Turk who lives in Bremen. And a decade ago, he wrote a book called 5 Years of My Life, An Innocent Man in Guantanamo. This is the quote. "We have to describe how the doctors came only to check whether we were dead or could stand to be tortured for a little longer." 2 weeks ago, in a landmark case against impunity for torture, 2 American military psychologists reached a confidential settlement on a case that should have been heard tomorrow. This confidential settlement with former prisoners was what they had to do because they couldn't face a jury trial. For months, the lawyers of these 2 men, Doctors Bruce Jesson and James Mitchell, made repeated unsuccessful attempts to get the trial stopped. Some of you will remember there are British parallels to this. It was 6 years ago that the government reached a confidential settlement with the former Guantanamo prisoners here in order to prevent MI5 and MI6 material and personnel appearing in a British court. And later on, they paid a Libyan couple the same thing, who'd been victims of rendition. But the Mitchell-Jesson case is a sharper forecast. These 2 men, they designed, they oversaw, they participated, and they trained others to carry out the CIA's torture program on Muslim men. And if anything marks what the war on terror, the flavor of the war on terror, it's this. This was the Bush administration's attack on international human rights law. And the normalization of terror and the demonizing of Muslim men are among the most terrible legacies of the war on terror. As you all know, 6 Muslim countries have been destroyed. Of course, the response to 9/11 should have been a police and legal response. Instead, what we had was doctors, other medical personnel like the 2 I'm talking about, lawyers, bureaucrats, politicians, and military who created a lawless jungle as they flouted international law and their own country's laws with impunity. And today's counter-terrorism programs across the world, some have been mentioned in this country, PREVENT, are built on these new norms. I want to take Yemen as an example. It's already been mentioned. As you know, for more than 2 years, there's been a Saudi-led coalition supported by the United States, bombing and fighting this devastated country where people are starving, uncounted civilian casualties, and to top it, there's a cholera epidemic. In the name of counter-terrorism, Yemen today has a network of secret prisons run by the United Arab Emirates and Yemeni forces. In these prisons, torture is routine, and United States advisors participate in interrogations of suspected Al-Qaeda or ISIS prisoners. Some of these men and boys are interrogated on United States ships, illegal of course. Others are held in the UAE military base in Eritrea, illegal of course. And it's thanks to the work of Human Rights Watch, of Amnesty, and of the Associated Press that we know these details today. What it tells us, the whole Yemen experience, is that we're still in the post-9/11 mode of Muslim men who had disappeared from many countries, held in secret sites across the world, ending up in Guantanamo Bay, where some died in hidden CIA torture facilities in that US base. The Rumsfeld-Cheney-Bush narrative of the worst has set a terrible anti-Muslim tone, which has lasting effects, and not least in how the West is treating refugees today. Let's remember that the majority of those men in Guantanamo Bay had committed no crime, as academic and legal work very soon established. Now, later this month, in a grim victory for the US government's evolving new counter-terrorism practices, a Washington court is going to hear a case which lawyers have tried to stop, arguing unsuccessfully that US constitutional rights were violated. Ahmed Abu Khattala was kidnapped from his home in Libya in 2014 by a secret US Special Forces snatch team. He was held on board a ship for 13 days of interrogation before being charged with 18 counts, including murder related to the 2012 attacks in Benghazi, in which the American ambassador was killed. Now, these are new norms of counterterrorism which are changing our world, and they're crimes, and they have to be repeatedly challenged as morally unacceptable and completely illegal under international human rights law. Thank you. Now, just to keep cheerful, the Mitchell-Jessen case settlement is a landmark precedent. Torturers can be brought some way towards account in the United States. These two men were paid $81 million for their work as contractors to the CIA. They began that work in a secret prison in Thailand with a wounded Palestinian, a Saudi citizen. Abu Zubaydah was waterboarded 83 times in a month, and he suffered most of the brutal practices made public in the December 2014 summary of the Senate report into torture in these CIA secret prisons. Zubaydah's treatment was the template of the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques created by Mitchell and Jessen, according to John Rizzo, who was the senior CIA lawyer at the time. Prisoners were held in small boxes. They were thrown against walls with a towel around their neck held by the torturer. They were kept naked with icy water poured over them. They were forced to hold stress positions. They were held upright in shackles for days to prevent them sleeping, and much more. Of course, none of this was supposed to ever become public knowledge. John Kiriakou, the former CIA chief of counterterrorism in Pakistan, went to prison in the States for being a whistleblower on waterboarding. Videotapes of the prisoners' torture, including Abu Zubaydah's, were ordered destroyed by the CIA's head of counterterrorism, Jose Rodriguez. Now, Zubaydah had already given important information to Arabic-speaking FBI interrogators who stayed with him when he was first captured seriously wounded. The CIA, Mitchell, and Jessen were sure there was much more to know, much more that could be had by torture. Zubaydah had nothing to tell. By the end of the year, Zubaydah had been shipped to a secret CIA site in Poland. Only years later did the authorities quietly admit that Abu Zubaydah had never been a member of Al-Qaeda. Every charge against him was false. Astoundingly, today, while we're here, he's in Guantanamo Bay. One of the things the Senate report revealed was that Washington had accepted his torturer's request that if he survived the torture, he would never be freed. Now, back to the case. In connection with the case, there were filmed depositions from Jessen and Mitchell, which were obtained by the New York Times, made earlier this year. They show the two men justifying what they did claiming that these experiences in their programs were not painful. These are the words they used instead: distressing, uncomfortable, irritating, discombobulating. They claim, too, that they acted under pressure from counter-terrorism boss Rodriguez in Washington and others to keep on pushing for that information which would keep America safe. Jessen says on the film he's still very convinced the program would cause, quotes, no lasting harm to the subjects. And in another video, Rodriguez also says, no lasting harm. These are completely astounding judgments, given that one of the people in the case is actually dead, killed by them. Now, nobody who's read the details of the Senate summary or the wonderful book Guantanamo Diary by the wholly innocent former prisoner Mohammed Salahi, who was tortured to breaking point, could have anything but utter contempt for these assertions. There are also video depositions by the two surviving former prisoners in the case, Suleiman Salim from Tanzania and Mohammed Ahmed Ben Saud, as a Libyan. These videos are stark pictures of quiet men whose lives have been destroyed. Neither can bear describing the pain they suffered. Mr. Salim breaks down at the question. But their faces and their body language and their lives show just how deep is the lasting harm. Salahi's book, written while he was still in Guantanamo, was a bestseller and translated into many languages. His lack of bitterness, his sense of humor, and his keen insight into the politics behind what happened to him as the Americans shifted him from country to country for more torture in a fruitless attempt to link him to the war on terror. It's won him admirers and readers around the world. Today, he's stuck at home in Mauritania, denied a passport. He sent me a recent email while I was preparing this talk. It's a vivid picture of how this clever, curious man, an inveterate traveler and a student, has had his life closed down. This is what he put in the email. To be honest with you, I'm really sick and tired of having been punished for so many years because I was born in Africa. I'm tired of being afraid all the time. This twisted logic, saying that because I was kidnapped, tortured, and held captive for so many years, this is the reason to violate my civil rights some more. It's just beyond the pale. At this very moment, my doctor told me I have to seek medical treatment outside the country. I have no passport to do so. This is not a game. I was operated on in Gitmo, and I'm still suffering excruciating pain, which my Mauritanian doctors couldn't figure out. There are many other ex-Guantanamo prisoners who are denied passports, like Salahi, and thus deprived of family contact in some cases, in other cases of job opportunities, or like Mohamedou, of health treatment. Now, Jessen and Mitchell were sued by Salim and Ben Saud, who survived these techniques, and by the family of the third man, Gul Rahman, who I've mentioned. He died in Afghanistan in November 2002 in CIA custody. Rahman had been interrogated by Jessen personally for 48 hours, and Mitchell, too, had participated in one of the sessions and had also administered a mental health status examination and provided an assessment of the interrogation measures. Later, one lead CIA staff officer at the secret site, Cobalt, told investigators that Rahman was the responsibility of Jessen. The psychologists watched the prisoner subjected to what they called a hard takedown. He was dragged from his cell, had his clothes cut off, his hands taped, a hood put over his head. He was run up and down a hallway and sometimes stumbled and was dragged. He was also slapped and punched in the stomach. When Jessen and Mitchell left Cobalt, Rahman was on an interrogation plan prepared by Jessen, which included subjecting him to freezing temperatures. 6 days later, Rahman froze to death, shackled and naked from the waist down. The temperature in the cell was 2.2 degrees centigrade, 36 degrees Fahrenheit. His family wasn't told that he had died. Now, this suit was brought by the ACLU, one of the many American lawyers' groups who've spent the last 16 years in dogged attempts, mostly unsuccessful, to uphold US laws and international human rights law against successive US governments. We've had British and other European lawyers who've also fought against our government's role in complicity in torture, kidnapping, and denial of human rights law. Now, as a result of these lawyers' work, it's not only Mitchell and Jessen who've had to pay up, but some governments, Poland, Canada, and the UK, all paid up under pressure to a fraction of the men we're talking about. But none of the countries which hosted CIA sites, like Afghanistan, Lithuania, Thailand, or those which took over US prisoners for torture, Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan, have ever acknowledged, paid any compensation, or apologized for what these prisoners of the United States suffered at their hands. Now, to me, this conference, with its huge range of knowledge, insight, research, is, as I think Paul Rogers said in different words this morning, it's part of an ongoing community in various battles for justice. And part of that battle is against impunity. It's against forgetting. We need a truthful narrative of a dark, dark period when American leaders, aided by many others in the West, opened a Pandora's box called counter-terrorism. Many thousands of people were and are complicit in the massive web of deception, illegality, cruelty, and Islamophobia that I've just touched on. Now, the most powerful lawyers and politicians who should be accountable to us all for this normalizing of torture have, unsurprisingly, been embraced by the power of the establishment. They have top jobs in legal firms, in academia, or in government, and they probably feel themselves protective in their immunity. Now, I'm an optimist, and I believe that the precedent of the Mitchell-Jessen case will have proved them wrong in the end. And what's at stake now is preserving this international architecture of human rights law which has been laid out so carefully here. Nuremberg and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention Against Torture, and many others, the Geneva Conventions, were all set up in the chastened aftermath of World War II, and they were to be the basis of a wholly different world, different from the barbarism of that war and its terrible endings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Who could have imagined that those great gains for our common civilization would be deliberately dismantled by small men in powerful positions, politicians, lawyers, doctors, and the military? We can't allow them to succeed. And it's people like us, with our networks and our convictions, that I think has to be the beginning of small ripples to make sure they don't succeed. Thank you very much.